The United States is a major source country for genetically modified crops and products that are distributed around the world. So it is important to consider how U.S. regulations label and deal with these resources at their origin. Over the past few decades, the number of genetically modified organisms has escalated at an alarming rate. Ideally, GM crops are developed where the genes from the DNA of one species, even an animal, are extracted and merged with the gene of a plant. GM plants are referred to as transgenic organisms as they involved transferred genes. Scientists have been using genetic engineering to develop GM crops, creating an essential sustainable method of feeding ever-increasing world populations. GM crops have the capability of lessening the use of herbicides and pesticides, both of which have the capability of harming the environment and directly harming human life. Nevertheless, critics of GM crops argue that they lead to the development of food allergies, antibiotic resistance, and cancer. GM crops also impact the environment in general. It is crucial for all developers of GM crops to meet all safety requirements similar to foods grown from non-genetically engineered plants. And even this might not be enough to guarantee the safety of these foods to humans or the environment. The United States has no specific federal legislation that regulates GMOs. Normally, the regulation is based on safety, health, and environmental laws, which governs conventional products. The approach to regulation of GMOs focuses on the nature of the product. Comparing and contrasting the situation in Europe and America is instructive. Here, the focus will be on the situation in America, which in theory is very strong. The coordinated regulatory framework of GM crops consists of the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the Food and Drug Administration. As an agency of the federal government, the EPA was formed to protect the environment as well as human health by writing and implementing regulatory measures based on the laws approved by the United States Congress. The key responsibilities of the EPA includes issuing licenses related to the environment and protection and preservation, enforcing laws that protect the environment, and coordinating planning, education, and guidance programs to preserve the environment. The USDA was formed mainly to oversee the U.S. farming industry. Thus, as a cabinet-level agency, the USDA's main role is conducting food inspections to determine if the required safety level is attained. The agency uses various laws and acts passed by the U.S. Congress in an effort to promote the agricultural industry. Finally, the FDA's main responsibility is to protect and enhance public health by guaranteeing the safety and security of human foods. Each of these three regulatory agencies plays a significant role in protecting consumers from purchasing harmful foods. They also regulate gene transfer, or genetic engineering, processes. Thus, the form of regulation differs depending on the type of GMO. The main aim of the presentation is to exemplify how each of the regulatory agencies controls GM crops in the United States.
Here is an illustration that shows clearly how a potential GM product would go through regulatory hurdles before it would finally reach the consumer.
The FDA plays a crucial role in protecting the public health by enacting regulations which govern food supply. The FDA regulates the safety of GM crops consumed by both animals and human beings. The agency uses the same measures to regulate both genetically engineered foods, GE, and other foods. The agency employs the use of Food Safety and Modernization Act to prevent public health problems. The goal is to prevent the outbreak of an illness caused by foods. Under the new sampling approach, the FDA collects a statistically determined number of samples of targeted foods over a short 12 to 18 month period of time. The sampling approach helps the FDA to determine if there are any common factors among positive findings, such as season, region, or whether the product was produced domestically or imported. The FDA's past approach to microbiological surveillance sampling has been to collect a relatively small number of samples from many different communities over many years. GM foods are generally considered safe since the protein of the genetically engineered substance added to a food has a likelihood of being similar to substances already in the food. Nevertheless, the developers of genetically engineered crops should consult the FDA and share information. The agency regulates food by outlining strict laws which stipulate that it is illegal to produce, process, and sell unsafe food to consumers. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act enables the Food and Drug Administration to conduct its regulatory activities effectively. The FDA was given the mandate to oversee the safety of food, drugs, and cosmetics in the United States. Since 1938, there have been various amendments made to the Act as technology in food production continues to diversify. The amendments, such as the Durham-Humphrey Amendment, prescription-only status for some drugs, has expanded the scope of the law. Under the FFDC, GM crops do not require pre-market approval since they are considered similar to non-GM crops. The insertion of genes that differ in functionality, quality, and structure is considered potentially harmful. Under such a circumstance, the FDA applies the FFDCA that ensures pre-market approval of such foods. For instance, the FDA regulates adulterated food, which is defined as any food that contains poisonous substances which may have lethal consequences to human health. The FDA uses the Plant Biotechnology Consultation Program to cooperate with individuals creating GM crops, helping them ensure that the foods produced are safe and lawful. GE plant developers must participate in the program before bringing food onto the market. The FDA uses the Plant Biotechnology Consultation Program to incorporate GM crop producers meeting with the FDA and explaining their products. The FDA later provides feedback to ensure safety standards are met before the resulting foods are introduced to consumers. The FDA uses this consultation process with producers of GM crops to ascertain if foods are free of allergens and toxins caused by transgenic processes. During the FDA consultation process, GE developers must conduct a safety assessment. This assessment enables developers to identify the attributes of new traits introduced in plants and assess whether the GE plant is safe for general consumption. To have a positive result, the developer compares the GE plant with recommended levels of nutrients contained in foods previously examined by the FDA. The FDA evaluates the submitted safety assessment by the facilitator. The FDA conducts an evaluation of the data and information. The consultation is considered complete by the FDA after scientists are content that the safety assessment submitted by the developer adequately addresses the concerns of the food safety issues. Conducting such activities enables the FDA to support the conclusion that foods from conventionally bred varieties are as safe as a new plant variety. The FDA regulates GMO in food, drugs, as well as other biological products. Under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act of 1910, no individual may sell, use, nor distribute a pesticide not registered with the EPA. There are a few exceptions. Under the Act, the EPA must identify each pesticide as general use, restricted use, or both. General use means general public. Those labeled as restricted use require specific credentials and certifications through the EPA. As coordinated regulated activity, the EPA also works together with the FDA and USDA to control GM crops in the United States. Ideally, the main role of the EPA is to come up with strategies which ensure that both human and environmental health are maintained. As a regulatory agency, the EPA controls biopesticides, which includes Bt toxins under FIFRA. The EPA plays a crucial role in regulating biotechnology use in pest management. Biotechnology includes genetically modified microbial pesticides, plant-incorporated protectants, as well as herbicide-tolerant crops. To guarantee that the toxin is harmless and can be used for environmental-related purposes under FIFRA, there must be no foreign protein, such as Bt toxin, in foods. FIFRA uses Section 3 to ensure that pesticides are registered. The enforcement stipulated by FIFRA mainly focus on the sale, distribution, and usage of pesticides. Before a pesticide can be sold or distributed, it must be on the EPA register. Apart from using the FIFRA to regulate genetically engineered pesticides, the FDA uses the FFDCA, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Under Section 408 of the FFDCA, the EPA is able to set tolerance for allowable residue of pesticides applied to food consumed by people and animals. Normally, before any pesticide can be marketed in the country, the EPA scrutinizes a pesticide appropriately. Such regulation ensures that presence of pesticides does not pose an unreasonable negative impact towards the environment and human health. Before the EPA registers pesticides under the Act, the applicant must demonstrate that the use of the pesticide is in accord with safety concerns. In essence, the use of the pesticide should not have general unreasonable effects on the environment when used. FIFRA defines unreasonable adverse effects as risks that may have negative impact on the environment considering the social, economic, and environmental benefits. The EPA also plays a significant role in regulating the genetically modified microorganisms. The Toxic Substance Control Act enables the EPA to regulate GMO. In particular, the Act allows the EPA to control a chemical substance that can be harmful to the environment. The Act provides a venue through which the EPA can exercise authority to report, keep a record, as well as test requirements related to chemical substances. The Act allows the EPA to protect the environment and human health by enabling the agency to issue rules necessitating that each of the chemicals to be tested and establish requirements. These restrict the importation, distribution, and use of potentially harmful substances. Every manufacturer of microorganisms must submit a notification to the EPA to guarantee that they are safe. Specifically, manufacturers must submit a microbial commercial activity notice, which describes the characteristics, genetic construction, as well as environmental effect of the microorganism. The USDA develops federal laws that govern how farming is conducted in the United States. The agency helps American farmers to develop genetically engineered crops which meet required standards. The agency regulates and monitors how biotechnology is used for agricultural purposes. The USDA controls GM crops using the PPA enacted in 2000, the Plant Protection Act. The Act specifies that plant pests are organisms with the capability of causing diseases. The PPA regulates GM plants if they were created using gene transfer or they incorporate DNA from a plant pest. Under the Act, a plant pest is defined as a bacteria, protozoa, parasite, or fungus which has potential for causing damage or illness to any plant. The agency reviews data from the field trials to ascertain whether a plant is capable of becoming a plant pest or cause any negative impact on the environment. The PPA enables the Secretary of Agriculture to restrict the entry via permits of plants that may lead to the dissemination of plant pests into the U.S. The USDA may test a transgenic plant to ascertain if there is no significant plant pest risk from extensive planting. The Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, it's clear someone had a sense of humor when they gave this acronym, is an agent of the USDA and emerges as a very important agency. As a part of PPA implementations, APHIS regulates the importation, environmental release, and interstate movement of GE plants and crops considered as plant pests. BRS coordinates with APHIS to control the introduction of plant pests as stipulated in 7 CFR Part 340. This means that this section, the regulations allow or reject the introduction of any GE plant that is believed to be a plant pest. Most GM crops are considered as regulated articles and thus they are subject to USDA jurisdiction. The proposed revisions of this section would enable the regulatory framework to be more focused and deal with GE plants that pose a significant plant pest risk. The amendments proposed would be beneficial to producers and consumers of various genetically engineered organisms, since some of the plants are genetically engineered to produce pips, which fall under the regulatory oversight of APHIS. Ideally, the agency provides a framework which helps in ascertaining that plant health is maintained, which means that the plants which pose significant risks to plants and animals are regulated by APHIS. On November 7, 2017, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service withdrew the proposed rule to revise the agency's biotechnology regulations that had been announced in January. How the U.S. Department of Agriculture regulates GM crops. Authorization is granted to applicants who intend to use GM plants by the APHIS in 3 major ways. They include the notification process, determination of non-regulated status, and permitting. Under the notification procedure, APHIS stipulates that all plants that are not considered as noxious weeds can be authorized using this procedure. Such plants must be species determined by APHIS to be safely introduced. The permit procedure demands all applicants to submit information related to the characteristics and composition of the regulated article for approval. Determination of regulated status is available for GM plants which has been tested and affirmed not to pose risks. The authorization of GM plants is one of the most important regulations of GM crops by the USDA. The Coordinated Framework for Regulation of Biotechnology, proposed in 1984 by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, presents the basic federal policy for regulating the development and use of products derived from biotechnology. It can be seen here many of their areas of competence overlap. GM crops are regulated under the coordinated framework. The coordination is between the USDA, FDA, and EPA. They are three agencies that, at least in theory, work together to evaluate GE crops. The USDA uses APHIS to regulate plant GMOs under the Plant Protection Act. The Plant Protection Act, in this case, is to allow APHIS to control and regulate the introduction of plant pests. This is crucial in regulating GM crops, which may pose significant risks to food consumed by the public. The FDA regulates drugs, food, and biological products using the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Chapter 2 of this act refers to prohibited acts, and penalties are available in both civil and criminal law. The EPA regulates GMO pesticides and microorganisms under the Toxic Substance Control Act and the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. The latter act enables the EPA to control the introduction of chemicals into the United States. FIFRA also enables the EPA to regulate the sales and distribution of pesticides in the country. The form of regulation undertaken by each of the agencies vary depending on the type of GMO involved. Thank you very much for your attention.
There are many sources available online. Perhaps the most useful is How the FDA Regulates Food from Genetically Engineered Plants.